Ready to rock and roll?
Let's do it.
RTR, ready to rock.
I mean, this would be the tallest building in most of our states.
One column failed first, and then all the others failed.
Yeah, pretty straight down.
Probably experienced some sort of an explosion.
They were burned out in more than an hour.
Why there was no firefighting in that building?
Tonight on The Conspiracy Realist, we peel back the layers of a narrative woven into the fabric of our collective memory, exploring corridors of doubt that linger around the tragic collapse of the towers on September 11th. As the dust settled, the questions arose. Were the stories told and explained and explanations given as solid as the steel that once reached towards the sky? Or did they collapse under scrutiny, like the twin giants on that fateful day? Joining us in this probing inquiry is Richard Gage, a voice synonymous with the call for transparency and a re-examination of the rubble, of what we thought we knew. Together, we will sift through the debris of official accounts and alternate explanations, seeking sparks of truth in the dark. So stir up a dusty drink from the depths of your bar and settle in as we mix our potent ingredients of inquiry and revelation in tonight's cocktails and conspiracies. We are the Conspiracy Realists, and my name is Shane Skwarek, as always here with my co-host, Mr. Philipps. And tonight we welcome San Francisco Bay Area architect Richard Gage, AIA, a member of the American Institute of Architects and founder and former CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He now leads the charge for a new World Trade Center investigation along with his courageous wife Gail at richardgage911.org. As an architect, he has worked on most types of building construction, including numerous fireproof steel frame buildings. Most recently, he worked on the construction documents for a $400 million mixed-use urban project with 1.2 million square feet of retail, parking structure, and mid-rise office space, altogether about 1,200 tons of steel framing. Richard, it's an honor and a privilege to have you here with us tonight.
Well, thank you. Great to be here with you too, you guys. This is an incredible opportunity to get some really important information to a whole lot of people.
So the subject of our show tonight is something that's near and dear to the hearts of Tim and I. We grew up a stone's throw away from New York City. And, with that, we knew a lot of people that directly or indirectly through friends and family that were involved in almost every aspect of, that day in 9/11. So, given your background, I think it's pretty suffice to say that you've certainly got the professional experience to talk about literally everything we're going to cover here tonight. But I think the curiosity for us is, why did your interest in 9/11 really start?
Oh my God, I was shocked in 2006, 5 years after 9/11. I had never heard any alternative theory as to how these towers came down. All of a sudden, I'm listening to this radio interview with David Ray Griffin by Bonnie Faulkner on KPFA's Guns and Butter program in the San Francisco Bay Area. And man, I was shocked to hear the kind of information that a lot of your people may be, listeners and viewers may be shocked to see. For instance, that a third tower came down on 9/11. I mean, I'm an architect. I would know if a friggin' third tower came down on 9/11. Yeah, so we're going to talk about that today. And David Ray Griffin's now written 14 books on the subject of 9/11. And I was going to try to just prove him wrong, and I got turned upside down, my whole world, actually.
It's wild.
Just my worldview was just turning literally upside down. I felt like I'd entered another universe with this information. And I started doing some research. I'm like, oh my God, this is all true, what he said. And then I took it to a couple months later, the architects, 14 of them that I worked with in Walnut Creek, California. And they all at first thought I was just nuts, but I bought them pizza. I made them come in and watch this presentation that you guys are going to see here today. Pretty much. It's been the same for about 18 years now. They all raised their hands. Oh my God, you're right. These are controlled demolitions. We've got to have a real investigation. So those are my first 14 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Now we have 3,600 on the petition, which you can see at richardgage911.org.
You know, it's funny you talk about Building 7. I remember when I started working in Manhattan, and you walk to work every day and you're always getting pestered by people trying to sell you something or take some change or whatnot. And there was always a guy, because I would come in through World Trade Center through the PATH trains. There's always a guy standing there shouting about Building 7. I always think, this guy's a lunatic, blah, blah, blah. For whatever reason, one day something he was saying to somebody else caught my ear and I stopped.
Oh.
And you don't stop in New York. You missed that train. We're seconds, right? Like everything's a game of seconds there. And it was the first time, again, growing up here and experiencing this pretty much firsthand. It was the first time I ever even heard about Building 7. And so, as with any conspiracy, there's always that jumping off point. At that point, you kind of look at it. And if you look at everything, I think with an open mind, that's the sort of piece that says, almost definitively in my mind, this is it. Like that doesn't seem right. Let's dive right into that.
Yeah, it's the one big thing that it never made any sense. And it's funny, right? We actually, Shane, you and I discussed, and we were talking with somebody else. This was months ago, before we even started doing this. And I forget how the whole 9/11 subject came up. And the other party, whoever it was, said, oh yeah, but a lot of that's been proven wrong. And I thought to myself, I'm like, yeah, but Tower 7 still doesn't make any sense. Right? And then, and to Shane's point earlier, Richard, we've watched a lot of your stuff and, we've delved deep into your content. And, when we found out that, you would be joining us, I was like, oh my God, we finally get to talk to somebody who knows everything about it. And, so let's get to it.
Yeah. We'll get into it. All right. I don't know everything. And there's a lot of things that I choose not to.
Comparatively figured.
Yeah. We got to stay pretty focused here. And as you'll see, it's going to be a deep dive.
Sounds good.
You ready to rock and roll?
Let's do it.
RTR.
I'm excited.
RTR, ready to rock.
All right. This is good. Let's do that, and that, because I don't want your audience to be the last to know what happened on 9/11. I mean, I felt like I was the last to know, right? This was just mind-blowing information. So we've got, as I mentioned now, 3,600 architects and engineers standing behind us, propelling us toward getting justice for the victims' family members today. And what we want to focus on is something that most people, even architects and engineers, know nothing about. I'm one of 90,000 members of the American Institute of Architects. We didn't get one bulletin on this, the third worst structural failure in modern history, the Twin Towers being the other two. It's like it was swept under the rug. But I mean, this would be the tallest building in most of our states, easily so, and only dwarfed compared to all the other buildings in New York to the World Trade Center towers. But this building was about a football field in length away from the North Tower. Here it is standing just fine. In fact, even after the towers came down that morning, there was some minor damage to the building, and some say it's major. It doesn't matter. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, they said, oh, that damage is not a significant factor in the building's collapse. Well, we'll find out what might have been, but let's look at that collapse first. Oh, where did that collapse go? Oh, that's interesting. Well, NIST. Oh, I know where it went. It went right here. That was NIST I was talking about. They did the 2008 report on the collapse of this building. And in it, they said this building came down by normal office fires. We'll take a look at that, but here's the collapse. The east penthouse on the upper left comes down in an isolated event, and then 6 seconds later, the entire building does this.
It's odd.
Yeah, like that's very odd. Well, like a slinky. We've seen that before. This is like the old hotels in Las Vegas, right? When they bring a building down by controlled demolition. Well, let's see what the official story is.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Fires. Well, let's think about this. Fires. Let's look at those fires. Well, here's the worst fires that we have any photographic or video evidence of. They're few, they're small, and they're scattered throughout the building. And they were burned out more than an hour before the building came down, which is completely takes NIST's theory of collapse initiation, pulls the rug out from underneath it, because they say, oh, this fire was occurring around this column 79 for the last hour or two of the building, but fires only burn in an area only half hour or so, and they move on looking for fresh new fuel sources. But these fires...
Richard, can I ask you a quick question?
You bet.
Am I correct in saying that in our modern times that no fireproof steel structure, skyscraper, has ever been brought down by fire?
We'll get to that. And the answer is yes, it is true that they haven't. So, but look at on the 12th floor. These fires are burned out at that time. That NIST is telling us that they're all throughout this floor around column 79, the area of interest in their collapse initiation. And we don't have time to go into the collapse initiation unless you want to ask that question afterward. It's an involved answer, but you're right, Tim. We've not lost one of these very hot, very large, and very long-lasting fires in these high-rises. Steel frame, fire-protected structures have never in history come down to fires, not even after 9/11, like you see in these fully engulfed skyscrapers. So,
wow.
If it's never happened before, it should have been the most studied failure ever. And yet, as I mentioned, it was swept under the rug. Engineers and architects, most of them don't even know that a third tower came down. That's why we go to the conferences all around the United States, and we show them in our evidence booth with the video of Building 7 doing exactly this on the left, and compared to a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never in history brought down a steel frame fire-protected building. So we got to ask ourselves, does it have any of the other features of controlled demolition? Well, let's see if there's a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure. Here's Dan Rather narrating for us his view of the collapse.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What did he say? Well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, here's Dan using his intuition, right, guys? We should all be using our own frame of reference to describe what we're seeing or experiencing. Unfortunately, he didn't repeat these words after 9/11 whatsoever. And in fact, with only 2 exceptions, we have not seen this building coming down on mainstream television at all. It's as if it's been swept under the rug. Well, feature number 2. Is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's look from West Street. Yeah, pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. That's an extraordinary feat. How does that happen? You have to take out all 24 core columns at once, followed about a second later, taking out all the perimeter columns. Any deviation in this pattern, which then has to be repeated, by the way, floor by floor throughout the building. And the building will begin to tip over if there's any deviation there. So this is a science that's not easy to do. There are plenty examples, therefore, of failed controlled demolitions. Are these fires capable of that level of precision? Key question. How fast is the building coming down? Yeah, this is even more wild. The physicists have clocked the speed of this building, like David Chandler, a physics teacher. They've noted that it comes down at free fall acceleration. Now that's as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. What's the difference? The bowling ball has no resistance under it. The building had 40,000 tons of resistance. So how can it fall this fast? In fact, NIST finally admitted, after denying for 7 years that it came down, it didn't come down by free fall. They finally admitted, after being publicly embarrassed by members of AE 9/11 Truth, the organization that I founded 18 years ago. And so they were finally admitting here, okay, it did come down at free fall. But they don't acknowledge the implications of free fall, which is what? That it had no structure underneath it. Well, where did all those columns go? That's the thing we got to ask ourselves. And anybody who's opining on this subject needs to come to grips with. Go ahead.
Richard, on these columns right here, all the columns you numbered right here, from 58 to 81, all in between, all of those columns had to come out simultaneously, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got it now. This
okay. Yeah.
And then that has to.
That blows my mind.
They have to be that has to be repeated on every floor.
So it's not just one column can be taken out on floor 7, where there's a fire going on. It takes out the column and it's just going to stack. That's got to happen on every single floor.
And ironically, in the upper right on the interior core columns, number 79, that's the one that they said failed. And then that caused lateral instability throughout the rest of the building over a period of 10 seconds. So, yes, that is their theory, and it is absolutely ludicrous on the face of it.
Yeah, I mean, if column number 79 was the one to fail, right? And let's say that was let's say their theory was true for a second, all right? And 79 fails. The building, obviously, untrained person here, right? But from my perspective, it wouldn't fall symmetrically if you had one column fail first and then all the others fail. It would almost be like chopping down a tree, right? If you're right, the tree's going to fall where you're causing the harm to the tree, and it's going to tip that way.
Exactly, and there are plenty of examples of failed controlled demolitions where they don't fall the way that they intended it to fall. And it's so easy for the building to begin to tip and then just to keep going in that direction. Right. Any natural collapse with fire, which is the official cause of this building's collapse, would have done exactly that. It would fall toward the injured, where the fire caused the greatest injury.
Right.
And in fact, do we have the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame? That's one of the features of controlled demolition also. Yeah, we have a moment resisting steel frame building where the columns and beams are welded very completely to each other, particularly around the exterior. And yet the building falls like a house of cards in a 6-story pile with the outer shell covering the inner. That's why there's a delay between the inner and then a second delay. Then the outer columns are, and that's to serve this purpose of bringing the outer shell onto the inner, having the inner pull the outer down upon it. That's what you want to do in controlled demolition, so you don't have debris everywhere all over the neighborhood. Like this. These are natural collapses. Wow. We have a building that falls over. You could recognize it at the base of the collapse. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, as we also see in Building 7. So, yeah, we have something to compare it to. Were there sounds of explosions heard by witnesses? Listen to Daryl, a medical student, heard on 1010 Winds Radio in New York that evening.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then the worst part.
Okay, that's pretty darn important of a witness. How about Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, who earlier was our witness of explosions? Well, before that, he and others were held back many blocks away from Building 7 because they were told it was going to come down. He's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker, and this is what he hears.
Wow. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
So that is his experience in witnessing of explosions. Later, we'll hear his experience of what he heard on that radio. Here's another gentleman who heard explosions. In fact, he saw a flash of light. Listen.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
Okay, and what did Richard Patterson, first responder and FDNY captain, experience?
1-7 let go as well, and was a series of concussive explosions.
Okay, and first responder Patrick Dillon.
I remember feeling that, like it was like freight trains underneath the earth, shaking the earth, even shaking me. That's when we all saw Building 7 crumple in the middle, like way up at the top. It buckled, and then dropped.
Very helpful. How many of these witnesses do you imagine NIST included in their report on Building 7? 0.
My inclination is 0.
I'm have to say 0 on that.
Swept under the rug, yeah.
It's interesting because I think you can make the argument that maybe the first witness, somebody calling to the radio show, not really reliable. Maybe the third witness, just some guy in the street, doesn't really know what he's talking about. But when you have an Air Force veteran that has probably experienced some sort of an explosion, if not in real life, maybe within training. When you have, a first responder, when you have somebody that's worked with the FDNY that have experienced fires, that have experienced catastrophes, their credibility to me is skyrocketed. And now these are people that deal with this stuff all the time. So it's, even though you can dismiss somebody calling into a radio show, it's really hard to start to dismiss all these other people that are in, for lack of a better expression, the face of disaster literally all the time. Interesting.
Yeah. In fact, let's look at foreknowledge. If these were controlled demolitions, then they would be planned in advance. Mm-hmm. And we would have people that know about it, such as Chief Nick Visconti, who says, what? We're moving the command post over this way. That building's coming down. And here goes 7. So he knows about it in advance. And Chief Hayden as well. He's talking to an engineer. He says, if we allow it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse? And how soon? Well, this is unprecedented, first of all, right? So why is he even asking?
But who would ask that question?
Yeah, and it turned out he was pretty much right on the money. In its current state, you have about 5 hours, the engineer told him. Wait a minute. This has never before happened in history, and you're telling us it's coming down in 5 hours? And it did, by the way. So this prediction could only have been made, of course, with foreknowledge. How about these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down? So now it's not only going to come down, it's going to blow up. Well, that's very helpful.
It's a curious choice of words.
Oh, yeah. Back to Patrick Dillon, first responder. Listen to what he experienced before the building came down.
All right. And he pointed to what turned out to be the entrance to Building 7's lobby. He said, go in there, take a break, there's other guys in there, like that. And that's what I did. I finished coming down off the pile and climbed over the wreckage of Vesey, and went in those revolving doors and just kind of fell on the floor. There were other guys in there doing the same thing I was, just shaking their heads and spitting out poison and trying to get their lungs back together again, as I was. And I was on the floor. These battalion chiefs come in through the revolving doors. There was 3 of them. They had the white helmets. I didn't get any IDs off them. But as soon as they stepped inside, what stepped in behind them were these 2 people in black with black ski masks on, and Uzis, and the Uzis were hanging off their necks, and I don't know what they were or who they were, but the battalion chiefs started yelling at us, right, ordering us to get out of this building. They're going to pull the building. Everybody out now, and they ordered us back out.
They're going to pull the building. That's a term used in the controlled demolition industry. Pretty interesting, and that testimony is backed up here, interestingly, by another first responder, again, Captain Richard Patterson, FDNY.
So he and I made our way over to the entrance of the building. Before we arrived there was a construction worker who happened to be, he emerged from the dust cloud and walked past the chief and I, and he said he had overheard the chief's comment, and he paused and said, that'll be coming down around 5 o'clock. We part ways, we arrive at 7, and there were 2 paramilitarily clad men with black rifles, sunglasses. And as we approached the entrance, they closed ranks and said, one of them said, this building has been secured, which is odd. because in my experience in the FDNY, anybody preventing access to the fire department in the event of a fire, that's a criminal act. The chief and I were not in a position to argue the point, given the inequality in weaponry present.
Okay, so we have these two credible witnesses talking about guys with Uzis or long rifles, and that raises all kinds of questions in and of itself. We can talk about that after we get through the technical evidence, one component of which is what Kevin McPadden experienced before those explosions went off, which was heard on a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker, having been held back about several blocks away from Building 7. This is his experience.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Whoa, what? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's really going on here?
Yeah, that's telling.
That's telling, as is the announcement of this building before its collapse, before it even happened.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. The building is still standing behind her, and they just announced its collapse. It doesn't come down for another 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, I've never heard a good explanation for that one.
Well, here's one. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does that make them psychic?
Statement. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask what the lotto numbers are tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think it's an honest mistake if the building is standing. The fact that the building then goes down.
Oh.
I mean, that is some Nostradamus kind of stuff. You know, that's just, it's very coincidental.
As is.
A lot of coincidences.
Yeah. CNN announced it that morning, though, not to be beat.
That's where it starts to get tricky now. Yeah. Why are they all getting the same news, you know?
Yeah. Listen to this.
In New York, Alan Dobbs-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sabga and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash.
Well, that is true. Downtown Manhattan was covered in the clouds of the Twin Towers collapse. We wouldn't even have any videos of Building 7 had it come down at that time. Was it supposed to come down at that time? If it did, we wouldn't have videos of the collapse. Many researchers suggest that it was supposed to come down, and that those mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7 were the guys who fixed the dud. And then then they knew that it would be coming down around 5 o'clock or so. Very interesting. So if you do connect some of these dots, you can kind of figure out what happens. Larry Silverstein helps us too. He's the owner of Building 7. He developed it in the 80s. And then he acquired the Twin Towers, the other 6 buildings of the 7 World Trade Center, of the 7-building World Trade Center complex. He acquired the rest of them just 6 weeks prior to 9/11. And a very interesting deal, which we'll talk more about. But listen to what he says regarding Building 7 a year later, interviewed on PBS.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
What made the decision to pull? Firefighters don't pull buildings. In fact, he says, I meant not pull a building, but pull the firefighters out of the building. Well, guess what? We were told again and again that the firefighters made the decision early on not to attempt to fight the fires. They were kept from fighting the fires in that building, is what we were told, what the truth is. But FEMA says there's no firefighting at all in Building 7. For whatever reason, they weren't there. So Larry Silverstein is not telling us the truth there either.
Fraudulent slip.
Yeah.
Was there ever any reason or an attempt at a reasoning as to why there was no firefighting in that building?
Yeah, they were told it was going to come down on its own. That it had structural damage from the Twin Towers.
Got it.
Which NIST later said regarding that was not a significant factor at all in the building's collapse.
Right.
Interestingly. But there are experts on this subject, by the way. And Danny Jawenko is one of them, controlled demolition expert. Let's listen.
Danny Jawenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Well, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
They opened a laptop right in front of him, and they said, look what's happening here. And he didn't know it came down on 9/11. All of a sudden it's coming down. He says what it is, like Dan Rather. Well, 24 or so structural engineers are signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation. Among them, Kamal Obeid, structural engineer, San Francisco Bay Area. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. So he knows. And one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, knows. And so he decided to do the job that NIST was tasked to do by Congress, but which failed miserably, as you've seen. So he puts all of the modeling of the structure into two independent programs, Abacus and SAP 2000, compared them to each other, and in the end determines that, well, on the right side we have the U.S. government, NIST's computer model, which shows 400 structural steel sections failing every second, but can't even begin to cause the building to fail the way we see in the video in the middle. In fact, it begins to tip over, so they stop it after 2 seconds. They had 7 years to produce this model, and This is all they could come up with. It doesn't look anything like the collapse. Professor Hulsey couldn't get it to fall straight down either until he took out all the columns in the building, floor by floor, within a second of each other, the interior followed by the exterior, and then repeat that on each floor. That's how you bring a building down. And that's what he found. And his conclusions, fire did not cause a collapse of this building. Temperature was not hot enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders, and the building didn't experience a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns. So that's what controlled demolition can do. It's not what fires can do, but he doesn't come out and say that because he's a structural engineer and he wants to stick to what he can prove exactly. And in essence, he did prove the controlled demolition theory without saying it. With additional evidence of extreme heat, we can really begin to find out what happened here. Do we have any evidence of ignited thermite from official sources? Well, thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. It can do this, what FEMA's metallurgical examination, included as Appendix 6 in the FEMA, Appendix C in the FEMA report, May 2002 Building Performance Assessment Team report. And this is what happened to the steel. They document it very carefully. Never before observed. Eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, causing a solid steel girder to turn into Swiss cheese, like we see in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel that they documented. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, that's molten iron. That takes 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The fires are in this building are only 500 or 1,000 degrees. So we're talking 4 to 6 times the temperatures here documented in this metallurgical examination, identifying liquid iron and sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Where did the sulfur come from? They don't know. All of this is quite a mystery, documented in part by the New York Times. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, they say, but it's completely omitted from the NIST report. They took it out when they took over the investigation in 2002. It didn't appear in the 2008 final report.
So, Richard, question for you, if you don't mind, real quick. And I want to make actually a statement and a question, right? So a lot of the pushback that you get from people when they talk about 9/11, they're only talking about the Twin Towers, right? Most folks don't talk about Tower 7. And they say, oh, you know, the jet fuel can burn at 1,500 plus 1,000 degrees and so on and so forth. And to your point, that's not even hot enough, right, to melt this steel. But I think it's important to note, we're talking about Building 7, right? There's no jet fuel on Building 7. That wasn't hit by any planes, right? So that's first and foremost, right? So that to me is that's an eye-opening, aspect of the story. And you mentioned thermite, right? Do we have any proof that thermite was used? Was there thermite found?
You're actually looking at it. And we'll be going into a lot more detail about just that. Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
And we're just diving in. But here we note that NIST omits this stuff. And we also know that it takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel, which Jonathan Barnett, the fire protection engineer responsible for this report, documents. He states steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. So now we have evaporation of steel. That takes 4,000 degrees. That's 4 to 8 times more temperature than these office fires ever were. I saw melting of girders. There's 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, says Abelhazen Astani Azel from the given a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel, structural engineer. Well, we know what the temperature of molten iron is pouring out of the debris from the crab claw excavators excavating World Trade Center site. We know what its temperature is by its color. That's just the physics of molten iron. We have 2,500 degrees minimum here. And hotter, because this is white hot material coming out of there.
Sure.
Well, you mentioned that there's no jet fuel in this building, but even at the Twin Towers, where we have the same evidence, the jet fuel only burns 600 degrees in open air, according to its primary manufacturer, ME Petroleum. Well, what can explain those higher temperatures? And what can explain the evidence of ignited incendiaries in the World Trade Center dust also? Yeah, the U.S. Geological Survey gives it to us on a silver platter, really. Their report came out in 2005, where they studied the dust in detail. It's called the Particle Atlas of the World Trade Center dust. They find billions of what? Previously molten, that's 3,000 degrees minimum. Iron, where's the iron coming from? We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. This is cast iron. Microspheres, molten iron microspheres. Spheres, how do they get spherical? We'll come back to that. This is incredible because up to 6% of these dust samples are previously molten iron microspheres. Up to 4 tons, in other words, of this material. Well, the EPA says, gosh, it's there. We don't know what it is, but it's a signature component. It's not even World Trade Center dust, in other words, unless it has all these previously molten iron microspheres. Well, the R.J. Lee Group, an environmental consulting firm, who studied this dust, says these are formed during the event, not before, by the iron workers putting the building together, not afterward, by the iron workers taking the building apart, but during the event. Well, how do we get molten iron microspheres? Experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. Let's do an experiment of thermite. Just a little bit. And what do we see? Thousands of what look like sparks, but which cool and fall into the pan as iron microspheres. How do they get spherical? That's just what aerosolized liquids do due to the surface tension forming themselves into spheres. That's what raindrops are. Could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars? Liquid falling iron microspheres. Is there any other rational answer to the cause of the toasting of the tops of these cars in this very high heat event, the heat of which is denied in the directed energy weapons theory put out by some? And we have to ask ourselves, do we have any evidence of unignited thermite? If that was all evidence of ignited thermite, and it can only be that, any evidence of unignited thermite in the dust? Well, yes.
So for my simple brain, we're talking about thermite that was placed in the building and didn't ignite.
Yes, unignited. Yeah, okay. Exactly. And that's curiously what a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen find in all of the 7 dust samples that were independently collected and sent to this team, which included Stephen Jones, Jeff Farr, and others. And so they start looking at this and they find these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. So it's fluid applied. It's like a paint. They thought it was paint. But it's attracted by a magnet. So paint doesn't have that quantity of iron in it. What does? They get real curious. They do a detailed analysis of the red layer, where the iron would be, and they find the ingredients of thermite, iron oxide, which is essentially rust, and aluminum, the ingredients of thermite, found unignited in these paint chips. Well, they're not normal paint chips, obviously, if they have the ingredients of thermite. So they zoom in 50,000 times and with a nuclear microscope, and they find what? Iron oxide crystals, rhomboidal shaped, and aluminum platelets, the ingredients of thermite, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair at the nanoscale. Very much an engineered substance. They go to the peer-reviewed literature and they find, yeah, this has been developed before 9/11 by Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. It's called super thermite, explosive composites based on thermite reactions, whose fuel and oxidizer constituents are intimately mixed on the nanometer scale. See, when you get it that small, these particles, the chemical reaction is virtually instantaneous because the surface volume increases exponentially. So you've engineered an incendiary which works by means of heat, massive heat, 4,000 degree temperatures, to become more explosive. In fact, the behavior of these chips in the Lawrence Livermore lab show us what to expect, us being the team of 8 international scientists, because at about 800 degrees Fahrenheit, they ignite. And that's exactly what happened to the chips that were being studied by the team of scientists. They ignite. What do you imagine they produced when they ignite? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found in all the World Trade Center dust by R.J. Lee and the U.S. Geological Survey. So we know exactly where those molten iron microspheres came from. As if we didn't know, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here.
And Richard, those red-gray chips that we're looking at, is that paint? So is that potentially paint that has thermite or super thermite inside of that paint? Is that what that is?
It's obviously fluid applied, and it has the constituents of thermite, so I wouldn't call it paint.
Okay.
I would call it liquid applied nanothermite.
But it could be applied like a paint, right? You could take that.
It certainly could be, and certainly was.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, you both just read my mind, because I was going to ask if these properties could exist in paint. But yeah, this has opened up a whole can of worms for me for questions.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, this is insane.
One of the questions that I had for you, because I've heard you talk about the thermite before. Did I say termite? Thermite. Was going to be, can the substances that make up thermite, the aluminum, you're smarter than me, aluminum oxide, the iron, can that be found in any other typical office and or construction material?
Well, iron oxide is essentially rust. It's certainly found here and there, sometimes everywhere over the steel beams. But this stuff is intimately mixed at the nanoscale, and aluminum flakes, you wouldn't expect to find those. There's aluminum cladding on the exterior, but these are blown off and falling to the ground. It's not going to be the source of the ignition which causes them to blow off, right? So that's an important element too.
Right.
And there's much more that could be said about that. But I mean, this stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It is extremely sophisticated. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. It doesn't form itself together from the materials in the building. No, it's impossible. And the team essentially concludes that the red layer of the red-gray chips is unreacted, active thermitic material, incorporating nanotechnology, not forming itself together by the building, falling apart. And as a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive. They're allowing for both possibilities there in the 24-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. So this has been uncontested since its submittal in 2009, its publication. So nobody's come forward and say, hey, I'm going to submit a paper disproving these results. You would think that they would do that right away, right?
Right.
Get rid of these conspiracy theories. No, this has not been done. People just simply wave their hands and say, no, that has to be paint. Well, paint doesn't have these exotic properties, right? So we have some key characteristic features here of controlled demolition, none of which can be accounted for by fire, the official cause of this building's collapse.
Right.
And there's some very uncharacteristic features here too. Thermite is not used often at all in controlled demolition, but is certainly capable. There are patented devices allowing for exactly that, but it's much more expensive than the traditional means of explosives to bring down with control buildings with.
But if you wanted to bring down a building in a clandestine way and you had the money and the manpower to get it done, that would be one way to do it, no?
Yeah. And especially with additional circumstantial and corroborative evidence and testimony, like we've heard, this is found to be proof of controlled demolition, a body of proof that has brought together 3,600 architects and engineers to demand a new investigation. And we have included them in our documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. Many of them will be included in the film series 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom. And that is the first issue, we hope to have it out in 2 weeks. So we've done all, Mick Harrison and I, he's the litigation director of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And he and I were filmed in Washington, D.C., and we're now in editing of the film. It's very exciting. And our audience members can co-produce the film. So a very exciting opportunity to work together with us to make sure that this film series happens all the way through each of the 24 episodes we're expecting, or at least a dozen. So participate in that at richardgage911.org. Yeah.
And we'll make sure to include that in all the social channels here. And for everyone watching this on YouTube, we'll have it in the description, Spotify, the description.
Fantastic.
I want to pause on Building 7 and just kind of field a couple questions to you, if you don't mind, before we kind of jump into to more Twin Tower stuff and kind of the bigger picture here. You know, it's fascinating to me. I almost wrote a novel with all the notes I was taking the entire time here, with just new stuff. And I already came into this, confounded by Building 7. So just being able to kind of see some of the new evidence here. One of the things that's kind of striking to me is, we talk about this paint-like material that, as Tim put it, and it makes it so obvious that, they could have been planning this out for a period of time. And for anybody that's worked in the building, it just looks like somebody's repainting the wall or something. It's just weird that the way the substance was set up. But I think the biggest question that I pull out of this, 9/11 itself, right? The Twin Towers, the buildings were a landmark. They were a symbol for the United States. They kind of lined the skyline of New York City. So in taking those buildings out, it sends a massive statement to America. Now, whether that's a foreign enemy, whether it's a domestic enemy, irrelevant to my point. What doesn't make sense to me is, why Building 7? What was important? Why did that building have to go? I understand the Pentagon. I understand the Twin Towers. I understand everything else that happened on 9/11. But Building 7, the collapse just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to the planes. And if you follow all this evidence through and you believe that it's controlled demolition, which I do, why? What is the why? Is there something that we're missing as to why they would want that building to go?
Well, it could be. We'd have to speculate. On the 23rd floor of that building was the emergency bunker that they called it, that was strengthened to survive hurricane force winds and control the city in the event of a major disasters like 9/11. Well, what if, and it was top security too, what if the planning for this conspiracy happened in that floor? That would be one reason they might want to get rid of the building. What would be another? The Securities and Exchange Commission, which was on the 12th and 13th floor, which, by the way, lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases that they were actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. The worst fires were on that floor. That's NIST's initiation of collapse theory floor.
Interesting.
So if you wanted to bury Enron and WorldCom, and they did, that would be one way to do it also.
One of the things I think I admire most about as you've presented this to us is, with the exception of right now, because we asked, you pointed, I don't think I noticed one single time throughout the entire presentation that you speculated. You made a point and you backed it up. And everybody that you had come on and you showed the clips of makes a point. And, you know, I don't remember the person in the clips specifically, but we had the one person that was, you know, structural engineer or whatnot, speculates on what could have happened from that standpoint, but won't speculate on the fires, won't speculate on the next point that's out of his expertise. Even though you might have an idea, nobody that you've presented evidence for, including yourself, has speculated on everything. You speak within your realm of expertise, and I think that's very telling, because a guy like Tim or I can come on. We can say anything we want, right? We're not experts in this field, and people will throw that back in our face. And everything we're going to say is, again, as researched as we could possibly be on the subject, anything we say will ultimately come down to, well, you're not an expert in such and such. And you don't do that at all. And nobody you've shown clips of does that at all. And that to me is like the most striking piece of evidence, because you have people from different, maybe not completely different industries or different expertises. They sort of overlap in some ways, but very different niches that are essentially saying the same thing when you fit those pieces of the puzzle together, but not necessarily directly. They're not speaking at a turn. So I wanted to let you know, I admire that a lot, just in this whole process.
Thank you.
On the next episode of The Conspiracy Realist.
If you're going to bring down a building of that magnitude, would you need to plant charges on every single floor? Why would the ground shake?
It looks more like the volcanic eruption. They collapsed 15 minutes apart. They were destroyed 15 minutes apart.
First thing that comes out of our mouths after the first building starts going down was that, oh my God, did they drop a bomb in there?
Trailed by thick white smoke cloud. And then it just came down.
Mind-blowing.
That is mind-blowing.